Hey everybody, welcome back. Today on my channel we're going to build a 4-liter Jeep engine. So for all of you Jeep fans out there, I've been talking about this, you've been waiting for it. Let's get started. Of course we took and cleaned the block, we put it in the vat, acid tank, we stripped it down completely, you saw that in the previous video. We put it through the acid tank and cleaned it, and we also bored the cylinders 30 thousandths over. We have brand new 30 thousandths over pistons. We also resized the connecting rods, which consists of shaving the cap and reboring the big end of the rod to make it so it's not out of round and tapered and so forth. So we have our new rings on here, our new pistons. We have our master engine kit here. This is basically what the kit consists of. It's a timing chain and gear set for, of course we want to replace that, and there's that. We have our rod bearings, we have our main bearing set, of course our gaskets. We have a set of cam bearings which we are going to put in here momentarily. We have our new lifters, we have new block plugs, we have an oil pump, and of course I have a new cam for it too. It's down on the bottom of the bench here. Yeah, so this is our freshly cleaned block. It turned out really nice. We bored the cylinders 30 over. So what we want to do now is we want to put the cam bearings in it. One of the things we do is we strip the block, and of course this hasn't been final washed yet. It's actually been sitting around for a month or two. So we're going to put the cam bearings in. Now it's real important when you put the cam bearings in that you line up the hole in the cam bearing with the gallery hole or the oil feed hole in the block. And of course the cam bearings are also location specific, and I'll show you that here in a minute. So this tool here is a cam bearing driver, and what this does is it takes our cam bearings and it drives them in, hence the name cam bearing driver. So if you'll notice here on the bearings, if we look at this, what you'll notice is each bearing location, 1, 2, 3, 4 over here, is assigned a number. So these bearings have their own spot that they go in. Now the difference in the bearings is not the inside diameter. The inside diameter of the bearings all the same. The cam fits through there, but what the difference is the outside diameter. They actually machine the bore and the block for the bearings slightly different for different locations. So it's important that you get these in the right location based on the numbers here and the number that is stamped on the bearing, so that we get the correct crush fit in there. So we've got number 1 here, it's N71, and we'll start out with that one. So we look at this here. That is N74, so I'm assuming this one's N71. Yeah, there we go, N71. So that's going to be our first location here. Now another thing that's important, you'll notice, is I have a towel underneath this block. I don't have the block sitting on the steel bench here. It's always important not to do that on the mating surface. So what we want to do is, this is the cam bearing bore here. We want to make sure that the hole in that bearing is lined up with that bore, so that thing's going to go in just like that. What I'm going to do is I always like to take a little mark and kind of put it in the center of my oil hole in there. That way I know that when I put this in, I can line the hole up with that, the oil hole up with that mark, and I make sure I get that in there just fine. The driver has an expandable head on it with rubber inside of it, and we just expand that out until we get that in. Now the one thing that we don't want to do here is we don't want to put these in off square. So what we do is we're going to rotate the block around the other way, and we're going to come in from the back side on this front bearing, and on the rear bearings further back we're going to come in from this side, because we have this centering cone that goes in and kind of centers up against this, because these have to be in a perfectly straight line. Installing cam bearings is usually something that you have the machine shop do. It's not really something that most people do. This driver costs about 500 bucks, this driver kit. It's really not feasible to buy a cam bearing driver just to put one set of cam bearings in, because, you know, it's like 35 bucks for the machine shop to do it. It's $500 for the tool. So unless you're doing a bunch of these, don't buy the tool, have a shop do it for you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get these in and then we'll move on from there. Once you get the bearing in, we're going to take our tool out, and then you want to visually verify that your mark is lined up there. So you want to take some kind of a light or something, whatever you can do to see that. And I can see by looking down there that that hole is perfectly lined up with the oil gallery. So we're just going to continue that for the other 3 bearings. I won't bore you with doing that on camera. But once we get the cam bearings in, then we'll make sure the cam fits and we'll move on from there. Okay, so we got our cam bearings in and we got our cam in most of the way. The cam is actually not in fully. Now when you put this in, you want to be careful with these, because one thing you don't want to do is gouge those bearings when you're installing this cam. So I always like to have access from the back here, and I like to just very gently work it in. We've also put a drop of oil on each one of those bearings. Now it's pretty impossible to get this cam in without putting at least a few scratches in the bearing, but what you don't want is just big gouges. So there you see it went in nice and easy. And we also, this thing should turn by hand. You shouldn't have any kind of binding. This thing turns real nice, so we don't have any issues with this. As long as the bearings go in nice and straight, you won't have any trouble. But you always want to put the cam in with a little bit of oil very carefully and make sure that it rotates. So now that our cam bearings are installed, we can pull the cam back out and we can continue with prepping this block for assembly. Okay, so what I've done off camera here, guys, is I went ahead and painted the block, and then I put the plugs in. I always like to paint the block first and then put these plugs in, especially if you're doing something for a customer, basically because they know for sure that you put the plugs in and you didn't just paint over their old plugs. Plus it just looks better. It looks nicer. So another thing that I did off camera is I final washed the crank. We take a very small rifle brush, engine cleaning brush, and we brush out all of the oil galleries on the crank and make sure that we don't have any crud in there. We wash it in solvent tank, and then we final wash it with soap and water. And we just want to make sure this is really clean. I actually have a couple other videos where I'm walking through washing the crank, and we also wash the block with soap and water and brushes. And I also, again, have another video that walks you through how to final wash the block and prep it for assembly. I didn't want to do that on camera because it just becomes redundant. So let's get right into the build here. So now that we've got our block final wash and we've got our crankshaft final wash, we can start assembling this thing. Now a lot of times I will put this on an engine stand and do it. All my engine stands are occupied except for the one right over there, which is a piece of crap and it's falling apart, so I'm not going to use it. We're just going to build this thing on the bench, which is fine. It's actually fairly easy to build engines on the bench, and so we're going to do it that way. So the first thing we're going to do now is we're going to put our bearings in and check our clearances. The bearing that has the hole or the slot in it is always the upper bearing that has to line up with these oil gallery holes in the block, and also your notch or your tang has to line up here. This is pretty straightforward stuff. It's not rocket science, and I think most of you probably know this already, but we want to get those holes lined up. So we'll get these all in, and we can check our clearances. Now, on the Jeep, remember that the number 3 main here, 1, 2, 3, is our thrust bearing. It has thrust flanges on it. So the manufacturers can put the thrust anywhere they want. On the Jeep, they've chosen to put it on the 3rd main. Some of them do it in the middle, some of them do it in the back. It doesn't really make any difference where you put the thrust bearing. It just has to do with where the engineers decided to put it. And again, keep in mind, the oil hole has to line up with the oil gallery. And if you put the bearings in right, they will line up. Okay, so we got it lined up nice there. Then we just put the rest of the bearings in and we'll be in business. Same thing with the caps. We're going to put the upper bearings into the main caps. Okay, so that's our number 1 cap right there. So now we've got our bearing in, the lower bearing, and then the upper bearing is in the block. And then I'm going to take the cap. Now make sure you put these caps on right. These caps are directional. The bearing notches always go to the same side. And there's also a notch, kind of a little dot or an arrow in the front of this cap that tells you which way is front. So we're just going to put our bearing cap in there. And you always want to put a little dab of oil on these bolts. You never want to put the threads in dry. So we're just going to, you don't need a ton of it on there, but we're just going to dab the bolts in some oil. We're going to put it on. Now the next thing you need to do is this. The cap sits into a register here, and you got to make sure that it is flush and seated. So we're just going to, then we're going to look at this visually and make sure that it is flush, and this one is. So we're just going to run our bolts down, and then we're going to torque these to specs. Now I'm going to do every one of these the way I'm going to show you this, but I'm not going to do that all on camera because it's just a majorly large amount of redundancy. Okay, so we got our crankshaft here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to mic this turkey. This is our freshly cleaned crankshaft. Now this is the number 1 journal, which is going to be up here on the front of the block where we put this cap on down here. What I want to do is I want to mic this, and then I'll show you how we're going to get that clearance. But one of the things we need to do is we need to make sure that we torque this cap on here. We're going to torque these bolts. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to mic this turkey. Put your mic on there, make sure you're in the center of the journal. We're going to lock our mic. Okay, so what I have here, this is what we call a 2 to 3 mic, which makes sense because the journal on the Jeep is between 2 and 3 inches. So what we have here is we have 2.501. So what we've done is we've duplicated the size of that journal right there. 2.501 makes sense because it's a 2.5 inch main on this thing. So then we're going to take and we're going to use this reading. You want to keep your mic locked right there to the size of that, and then we're going to compare that to this, and I'll show you how we do it. Okay, so with our mic, I'm going to put this mic in here. With our mic in here, we're measuring, or we're just putting the dial indicator right here where our measurement is, and then the dial indicator I zeroed it out. So we've got our bearing torqued in, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put our dial bore gauge very carefully right inside here, and we're going to measure the inside diameter of that bearing. And what we see is the difference is going to be our oil clearance here. And I have about 3.5 thousandths on my gauge here. Good, 3.5 thousandths. I'm going to go through and I'm going to put every single cap on here, and I'm going to check the clearances. The way I do it is I go to the next cap and I move this one out of the way. Now that I know this clearance is good, then I put this one on and I just go down the line. I'm not going to do that all on camera because, you know, again, you probably want to go watch something else. So I'm going to get that done, and when we get back and I establish that all the oil clearances are good, then we can start talking about laying the crank in this thing. And now it's time to lay the crank. But one thing I want to talk to you about here is the rear main seal. So before you can do or get into the operation of laying the crankshaft, we have to install our rear main seal. And our rear main seal, of course, is going to be in our gasket set. I normally like to use Felpro gaskets, but this is a real extreme budget build here. I wish it wasn't so, but sometimes you kind of got to go with what the customer's asking for. And you know, this is what he paid for, and this is what he's willing to live with, so this is what we're doing. My recommendation to you though, and these gaskets are okay, they're not bad, they're made by Engine Pro, but I don't like them as much as I like. My personal preference is Felpro. So here's your gasket set, and one of the things that we want to look for here is we want to look for our rear main seal. That's your rear main seal, and it's just two half moon shaped seals. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these. And we have to install those in the back of the block in order to put the crankshaft in. And it's actually pretty important that these go in the correct orientation, otherwise you're going to have a problem. So we're going to open these up, and that's basically what your seals look like. Now this seal here that has these extra little tangs on the side, that is going to go into your cap on your main cap. The other one is going to go into the block. So there's a lip on this seal, and you got to make sure that the lip always goes toward the oil. If you turn it around the wrong way, you're going to have oil dumping out the back of your block, and everybody's going to be really unhappy. So just make sure you get the correct orientation. We want the lip facing the oil. Some of these even say flywheel side on them. This one doesn't, but there is an arrow on here, and I'm not sure exactly what they're trying to tell us with this arrow, but I don't know. It says 1, has an arrow and the number 1, but nevertheless, the lip here, right there, that lip goes toward the oil. And you can see what happens is the crankshaft, as it rides on this, it kind of pushes that lip back and it doesn't let the oil out. So on this one, the arrow that's on the seal goes to the outside, and this lip's going to go toward the oil. So we're just going to install that right back here. You don't need any oil or anything on it to put it in there. You just install it right in the block like so, and we're in business. The other one is going to go into our cap, and if you look at the cap on the 4.0, the cap actually has some cutouts here, and again the lip's going to go toward the oil, and these little end pieces here just fit right down flush inside that cutout area on the cap, just like so. You don't need to put oil on these to install them. You put them in dry. However, you do need to lubricate that lip before you install the crank. You don't ever want to lay the crank on the seal or the bearing dry. That there always needs to be lube on there, just not on the back side of the bearing or the back side of the seal when you install it. So then we're going to take our fresh, clean engine oil, and we are going to make sure that we get that lip lubricated with plenty of lube. Now this seal might fit in there kind of loose on this, but it's kind of a crush fit, so the ends of this are sticking up above, and if it fits in there kind of loose, it's okay. That's pretty typical for the 4.0. And then of course you can use assembly lube on your bearings. I don't do that. I always use engine oil, and I'll tell you why. Assembly lube, or a thick barrier of assembly lube on here, it's fine. It definitely will protect the bearings during startup and so forth. But I don't like the way that it makes the crank feel when I put it in. It makes the crank feel a lot tighter. And I don't know, I want to make sure that it's not a little bit tighter because of the assembly lube, or it's tighter because it's binding. So I always put engine oil on these bearings. You don't ever want to touch these bearings with your dry finger, but if you got oil on your finger, it's fine. You got a barrier there. There's actually acids in your skin that will cause the motor oil to be repelled from this, but as long as you have engine oil on your finger or a squirt bottle or however you want to do it, as long as there's a barrier between your finger and the bearing of engine oil, it's fine. You can put engine oil. And you notice I'm not putting a ton of lube on here. I'm just putting enough, because you never want to lay a crank on totally dry bearings, that's for sure. So we've got our rear main lube, we've got our bearings lube, our crank has been final washed and measured, all the clearances are right, and now it's time to lay the crankshaft in this engine. So the way that we do that is you grab it in the front and the back, and you got to be careful, and you want to go look at your mains, and you want to go straight down in with this thing. It should, just like that. Don't drop it in there or anything like that. Straight down in. And at this point, you don't really want to turn it, because it'll pull that rear main seal right out of there. So now, before you put the caps on, of course, again, plenty of lube on top of that journal. Never put these things in dry. Make sure that the seal flange back here has plenty of lube on it. So we're just going to make sure that we got plenty of engine oil on each one of these journals before we start installing our caps and our new bearings. All right. And you just take your main caps and you begin the installation process. And again, you got to make sure that the caps are all seated in there. So it's our number one cap. We'll use the bolts to align it, and just lay your cap on there, kind of get the bolts started. And you can just go down the line with these. We've already established all our oil clearances. Now this is your thrust bearing. Now on the thrust bearing, you probably want to put a little bit of oil on that flange on the sides, make sure it's lubricated. And then just install your bearing, your cap and your bearing. Get the bolts started, but don't run the bolts down yet, because you still have to seat those. And the nice thing about the Jeep is all of the caps are numbered from the factory. This is number 4, so obviously it's going to go in the number 4 position. They were all numbered right from the factory. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go with number 5. And then 6 and 7. Now again, on this rear bearing cap where your seal is, let's make sure that there's plenty of lube on that seal. I know we put some on it already. Let's make sure that we got lube. Some guys will take and put a little dab of silicone here and here between the cap. But the nice thing about the Jeep is they actually have this extra piece of seal coming out here, and these usually seal pretty good without silicone. I haven't had any trouble with them. So a lot of the seals don't have this out here, and so yeah, you need to put some silicone there to keep it from leaking. Chrysler did us a favor on this one when they designed it, and they added an extra piece of seal in there so we don't have any leaks. Get your bolts started now. Of course, we want to seat all of our caps. Make sure all of your caps are seated, and you'll hear them snap or click down into place. If you try to torque these without seating them down in, you could actually damage the cap, crack it or break it. That one gets stubborn. There it goes. Sometimes the one in the rear main seal, you got to get it. You got to smack it pretty good to get it down there because of that seal. Okay, guys, so I got the main caps on, I got them seated, and I got them torqued to my first 2 steps. I've got them up to 50 pounds right now. So I do 30, 50, and 80. I do them in 3 steps, and I start in the middle and work my way to the outsides. I have one last step to do, so we're going to bump this up to 80 foot-pounds. The torque on the main caps on this Jeep is 80 foot-pounds. That's our final torque. Another thing that I did before I torqued the main that has the thrust bearing, I like to take and smack the crank in the front and the back just to kind of line those up. I take a soft hammer, rubber hammer, and I smack the crank back and forth. Never take a steel hammer to it. And then we're going to start in the middle, and we're going to go to our final torque here. I like to start in the middle, and every time I torque one, I verify that it still rotates. This thing should turn easy by hand with no binding. And we're just going to alternate caps from the center out. We want to make sure we don't have any issues with this thing getting tight or binding up. The crankshaft should turn by hand. You shouldn't have to put a wrench or anything on it at this point. It should just turn freely by hand, and this one does. It feels good. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to verify that I didn't miss one. Torque every one of them again, just to double check yourself. One of the things you always got to do on a motor is you got to double check your work. Never assume anything. If you're part of the same race I am, which is the human race, there is a definite possibility that you could overlook something and screw up. Believe me, I've done plenty of that. Okay, so I have verified. Now we're going to take all the tension off the torque wrench. Remember that. All the way back down to 0. Right there. And I always like to take a marker once I get these torqued, because I may walk away from this thing, and I just mark every single bolt. If I walk away from this thing for a day or two and I take the plastic back off of it because I'm waiting for parts or whatever, when I see these yellow marks, I know that I torqued it. If I walk away from this for a few days or a week, I can come back and be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I torqued those. But see, with the motor, you can't be pretty sure. You got to be 100%. Okay? So you always second guess yourself, always double check yourself. All right, so we got our crank in. Turns really nice by hand, no binding. I mean, it's just, if you got to put some kind of a tool on this thing up here to turn this crank, something's wrong. It should not be turning like that. This thing turns real nice. You got to make sure that your crank doesn't have any run out or anything. These long cranks have a tendency to get run out in them. This one actually was perfect, and we didn't have any issues with it, so we're good. All right, so the next step, now that we got the crank in, we got all our clearances checked, we got everything torqued, now we move on to the piston installation.